Donald Trump refers to himself as a political prisoner and blames you directly. What's your response to that, sir?
But I want the judge to give him 6 months. When you spend a year in prison in New York or under, you serve in Rikers Island, okay?
So lock him up. So lock him up. So lock him up.
Black sheep who have gone astray.
But let's look at the Democrats who actually tried to strip Donald Trump of his Secret Service. Benny Thompson introduced legislation designed to strip convicted felons, aka Donald Trump, of Secret Service protection, which was supported by other Democrats, including Jasmine Crockett. It's no wonder that people were not all that surprised that someone tried to take a shot at Donald Trump when there have been people openly calling for his protection to go.
If I may, Trump's Secret Service protection could be removed under Benny Thompson's proposed legislation. This legislation was introduced while the politically weaponized government was prosecuting former president.
That's how the American system of justice works. And it's reckless, it's dangerous, it's irresponsible for anyone to say this was rigged just because they don't like the verdict.
You're right. You shouldn't say that our justice system is rigged, unless you're Joe Biden's wife.
Think of the Supreme Court. For God's sake, talk about things getting worse. Can you imagine if we put any more Republicans on the Supreme Court? No. We will lose all of our rights. So we're talking about women's rights, gay rights. I mean, we will lose our rights and freedoms. Voting rights. Yes,
All of this is up at stake.
Within a 24-hour period, Joe Biden says we have to respect the judicial system, absolute respect. And yet he tweets, and the centerpiece of all of his speeches right now is, the Supreme Court tried to stop me, but I did it anyway on student loans. So I'm just wondering, which part of the judicial system do we have to respect?
The Supreme Court of the United States blocked me, but they didn't stop me.
Does it not offend you that the President of the United States is usurping your authority?
I would argue that the offense here probably is Donald Trump. The fact that
real appellate issues here that are serious questions about why didn't the defense even know what the charge was that they were going to be applying, what law that was going to be
Which
applying.
of these three underlying laws?
Exactly. And so there were a lot of questions for the defense going into this, I think, as they were making their closing arguments, not even knowing sort of what the law that they were going to be battling over was.
You had to twist yourself into a pretzel to figure out what the crime was.
The worst of it is they didn't tell the defendant what the crime was he was being charged with. Isn't that right, Judge?
That's correct. Right from the indictment, Donald Trump was charged with falsifying business records. To elevate that crime to a felony, he had to be concealing or committing other crimes.
When did the defendant in this trial, in this case, learn what he was being charged with?
At the end of the trial.
At the end of the trial. That's not supposed to happen in America, is it, Judge?
No.
What you've just stated is so utterly and completely absurd, it's almost impossible to even respond to it. This case will be reversed on appeal. The level of egregious reversible error that was demonstrated by this judge and by the prosecutors is absolutely off the charts. I've never in my entire career seen anything even close to it. I think you recognize that. I think the vast majority of the American people recognize that.
The election was in 2016. These accounting entries were made in 2017. How could an accounting entry made in 2017 be made with the intent to commit election fraud in 2016?
Well, and in fact, in this kind of a circumstance, that's what you see. We've got a situation where the alleged crime was committed in 2016, and they had to bootstrap it to something that occurred years later to try to resurrect what was really a dead case.
Another problem is that in New York State, there is a 5-year statute of limitations on most felonies, and that includes charging someone over falsifying business records. Again, the last alleged crime occurred on December 5th, 2017, and Bragg's indictment was filed March 30th, 2023. And if you do the math, that's 5 years, 3 months, and 25 days between dates.
So there weren't any losses in this case at all, were there?
Yeah, that's what makes this so remarkable. And just, I can't even imagine someone bringing a fraud case to the United States Attorney's Office where nobody lost money, there were no victims, and no one was worse off at the end of it. It just makes it laughable, even before you get to steps 2 through probably 20 that make this case really absurd to have been brought to begin with.
Have you ever seen anything like what they have done to Donald Trump in their effort to destroy who they perceive to be their political enemy? Mr. Bailey.
I have never seen such an egregious assault upon the tenets of equal protection as when government officials in the state of New York claim that they are specifically targeting one individual and will not use the same laws against anyone else. But I want to go back to the due process issue briefly, because everything that's being said here is further amplified by the fact that Section 175.10 of the Code of State of New York, which forms the basis of the 34 charges, has an affirmative defense that requires the defendant to get a preponderance of the evidence. How can he go get his evidence if you bring the claims late? Statute of limitations are intended to prevent sandbagging of claims.
Exactly right.
Anyway, Bragg said that these 34 false statements were made to cover up other crimes.
But for goodness sakes, we know what happened. So we have the state of New York, and they come in and they pass a law saying, well, we're not going to have a statute of limitations for this particular crime or this particular individual. Wouldn't that be considered a violation of this gentleman's due process rights?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's part of the overall context, which again kind of shows the political motivation, the uniqueness of this case. I mean, it just got more and more and more unclear exactly what Mr. Trump was being charged with. So all of these facts suggest that there is a shocks the conscience due process.
During Alvin Bragg's first year in office, 52% of felony cases were downgraded to a misdemeanor, and his office declined to prosecute over 1,100 felony cases.
Yeah, exactly. When you're letting carjackers out on bail or illegal immigrants that assault police officers aren't getting prosecuted, but this is the way you're using your time, in addition to the fact you run on a soft on crime policy and then you do take the most creative, aggressive approach to this crime, it's hard to argue as anything other than a political motivation.
They are charging him criminally under a New York law in a New York state court for breaking a federal law related to a federal election. They have no jurisdiction over this case. Not only that, federal agencies have looked into this case and decided not to prosecute Trump because there is no crime committed. But the biggest problem with this case is that the case is about non-disclosure agreements. The prosecution is calling this hush money, but it's really a non-disclosure agreement. There's nothing wrong with non-disclosure agreements. The prosecution is claiming that since Michael Cohen's invoice was for legal expenses and did not specifically label the payment as hush money, that it was engaging in fraud. I don't know if you remember, President Bill Clinton paid Paula Jones $850,000 to settle her claims of sexual harassment. Donald Trump is the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar company. Do you really think he's aware of some accounting entries that are being performed by some low-level accountant?
Isn't it true that in Alvin Bragg's campaign for Manhattan DA, Bragg specifically ran on going after President Donald Trump?
That is true.
Isn't it true that Bragg's predecessor, Cy Vance, declined to prosecute President Trump?
That is true.
And the FEC also did not prosecute President Trump.
That is true.
And the DOJ did not prosecute President Trump in this case.
The DOJ referring to the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District?
Correct.
Absolutely true.
And one of the reasons the Southern District of New York turned down this case was because the supposed star witness, according to Alvin Bragg, Michael Cohen, was totally, quote, unworthy of belief. Isn't that true?
Without a doubt.
This is the same Michael Cohen who pled guilty to 7 counts in an indictment that had absolutely nothing to do with President Trump and actually predated the first time he met President Trump, correct?
Absolutely true.
And in fact, this is the same Michael Cohen who perjured himself to Congress. Isn't that true?
Yes.
In fact, when called as a witness in this sham trial, Cohen was asked directly if he was honest during his testimony to Congress. He said no, admitting perjury. But it's not just Bragg's case that is a total sham and illegal political lawfare going after Joe Biden's top political opponent, Donald Trump. This rot goes deep all the way up to the top in the Oval Office. Because when Congress referred this admission of Cohen's perjury to Joe Biden's DOJ, isn't it true that the DOJ has refused to prosecute?
That is true.
Isn't it correct that Michael Colangelo was the third highest ranking official in Biden's DOJ, was transferred to Bragg's office to run this weaponized prosecution of President Trump? Isn't that true?
Not only true, but it's unheard of.
Unheard of. It's a disgrace.
The judge also told the jury, oh, you don't have to be unanimous in finding what we just discovered the charge actually was.
Yeah, it's an extraordinarily egregious error to tell a jury they don't have to be unanimous. And I might add, by the way, those charges, the 3 additional ones, were never specified. They're described generally, so we don't know what exactly the jury thought was the illegality that was committed by Donald Trump. We have a very inspecific verdict.
I'm wondering if you can specify what laws were also broken.
Right. So let me say as an initial matter, the indictment doesn't specify that because the law does not so require.
Translation? I'm not going to specifically tell you what crimes were broken because it's a secret. And to make matters worse, the 12 jurors weren't told either. The jury instructions state, in determining whether the defendant conspired to promote or prevent the election of any person to a public office by unlawful means, you may consider the following: violations of the Federal Election Campaign Act, otherwise known as FECA, the falsification of other business records in the second degree with intent to defraud, or violation of tax laws. You need not be unanimous as to what those unlawful means were. In other words, the ladies and gentlemen of the jury didn't have to come to the same conclusion as to the motive. You could have had 4 that believed that Trump violated tax laws, 4 that believed that he violated federal election law, and 4 that believed that he falsified business records in the second degree.
So I mentioned a couple of laws, which I will highlight again now. The first is New York State election law, which makes it a crime to conspire to promote a candidacy by unlawful means.
Bragg brought along with him charts explaining the case, with a line stating that there was an intent to commit or conceal another crime, including state and federal election laws. There are 3 problems with that statement. 1, Donald Trump was running for president in a federal election, which means that state election laws do not apply here. 2, if Trump did violate a federal election law, Bragg does not have the jurisdiction to indict someone for a federal crime. And 3, there is no mention of election law crimes, state or federal, in the indictment. It only lists 34 counts of falsifying business records. But if you read the indictment, there is no other crime listed. Ellie Honig, the senior legal analyst for CNN, writes, "This case was an ill-conceived, unjustified mess. The charges against Trump are obscure and nearly entirely unprecedented. In fact, no state prosecutor in New York or Wyoming or anywhere has ever charged federal election laws as a direct or predicate state crime against anyone for anything. None. Ever."
I'm wondering if you can specify what laws were also broken.
Right. So let me say as an initial matter, the indictment doesn't specify that because the law does not so require.
In other words, Alvin Bragg is violating the 6th Amendment of the Constitution by not disclosing to the defendant what crimes were committed or what laws were broken.
But why weren't there those crimes charged? Why wasn't he charged with those crimes?
Well, I'm not going to go into our deliberative process on what was brought. The charges that were brought were the ones that were brought. The evidence and the law is the basis for those decisions. Well, I'm not going to go into our deliberative process on what was brought. The charges that were brought were the ones that were brought. The evidence and the law is the basis for those decisions.
For example, months before the Trump indictment, it was announced that Matthew Colangelo, the acting Associate Attorney General for the Department of Justice, was leaving his position to become senior counsel for the Manhattan District Attorney's Office. Before the Trump indictment, it was announced that Matthew Colangelo, the acting Associate Attorney General for the Department of Justice, was leaving his position to become senior counsel for the Manhattan District Attorney's Office.
Do you believe that the president was directly involved in some kind of an effort to stand up the charges and the trial?
I don't know if he was directly involved in it, but we know he was indirectly involved in it because the number 3 person at the Biden Department of Justice left the DOJ to go join the New York prosecutor's office and actually go after Donald Trump.
And leaving a senior position at the DOJ for a senior position at a local DA's office is not a lateral move. It is a step down. And whether there is any truth to it, it looks like there was coordination between the White House and the highest levels of our government and the Manhattan DA.
Do you agree that this weaponization of lawfare goes straight to the top with the purpose of helping Joe Biden's failing presidential campaign?
The circumstantial evidence definitely supports that.
And the unconstitutional gag order on President Trump from New York Judge Merchan is unprecedented lawfare.
As far as I know, absolutely.
He also pled guilty to committing perjury. He was convicted of being a liar.
This guy, by any prosecutor's standard, and I used to be deputy chief of the criminal division in the Southern District of New York, I wouldn't have touched a guy like Michael Cohen, especially if he's a convicted perjurer. Not to mention, as I said, the 50 to 100 lies he told us that are in those 330 emails.
Well, just to be clear, did he ever specifically tell you that Donald Trump does not know about this?
Yes, absolutely. He said that.
He said that?
You know, that's what he said at the time. Is it true? I don't know.
Did you tell the grand jury that?
Yes, I did. But I had to force that into an answer. They were getting upset because they'd ask me a limited question based on one of these 6 emails, and I would volunteer information that I thought the grand jury needed to hear.
The Midas Mighty, so it's Midas Touch Network. And you'll see Mea Culpa podcast merchandise. Yep.
Okay, perfect. I didn't write it down yesterday and I thought I'll remember it. I didn't. All right, I got it written down and now I can get it.
There you go.
All right, I won't keep you long because that's all I really wanted.
And let's go to the daughter of the judge. Isn't it true that she is raising millions of dollars off of this sham case?
Well, I have to say I've read that in the media. I don't know it of my own knowledge.
It is true.
Lauren Merchan is the president of a political advocacy group called Authentic Campaigns, whose clients include the Biden-Harris campaign.
Thank you.
One additional question. I want to talk about the rigged and unprecedented jury selection process. Isn't it true that Bragg's team asked the jurors if they followed Trump on social media?
Yes.
And isn't it true that they did not ask any of the potential jurors if they followed Biden on social media?
Or Michael Cohen.
Or Michael
Yes.
Cohen.
Yeah.
And isn't it true that 87% of the jurors said they voted for Joe Biden?
That's true.
Is this unprecedented and lawfare jury shopping?
Without a doubt.
Stormy Daniels is a porn star. She met with Donald Trump in 2006 because he was thinking of offering her a spot on The Apprentice. She never ended up getting the job. Then, years later, in 2016, after Donald Trump received the Republican nomination for president, Stormy Daniels just happens to show up asking for money. She approaches the National Enquirer and offers to sell them her story, claiming that she had an affair with Donald Trump. What strange timing that she would come forward at that exact moment. Donald Trump has always maintained that he never slept with Stormy Daniels. Then we have the porn star, Stormy Daniels. It turns out that she made a signed statement claiming the affair never happened. I am not denying this affair because I was paid hush money, as has been reported in overseas-owned tabloids. I'm denying this affair because it never happened. Now, to be fair to Stormy Daniels, She now says that her written statement was a lie. She says that Michael Cohen forced her to release that statement. The National Enquirer is owned by a media company called American Media Inc. The CEO at the time was someone named David Pecker. David Pecker bought the rights to Stormy Daniels' story for $150,000. That means that she cannot tell the story to anyone else. This is what the media is calling the hush money payment. Donald Trump was not involved in any of this. Then, after this agreement was created with Stormy Daniels, David Pecker contacts Michael Cohen, who he knows is Donald Trump's lawyer. David Pecker essentially blackmails Donald Trump and says that he's going to print this ridiculous story unless he gets paid $125,000. That deal was never finalized. Instead, Michael Cohen starts negotiating directly with Stormy Daniels' lawyer. They come up with a non-disclosure agreement where she will not tell her story for $130,000. The agreement is drafted with fake names. So up to this point, Donald Trump has not been involved in any of this. Everything that has happened has been between the National Enquirer, Stormy Daniels, and Michael Cohen. Fast forward to the trial this week. The prosecution calls David Pecker as their first witness. When you try a case, you usually want to call your best witness first. They called David Pecker. He confirmed everything I have just explained. But more importantly, he explained that Donald Trump had no idea what was going on. Donald Trump was not part of this agreement. He wasn't involved in the negotiations. He did not sign the contract. He did not pay the money. David Pecker also confirmed that having non-disclosure agreements is something that he does as a normal part of business. The agreement is drafted with fake names. The name Peggy Peterson is used for Stormy Daniels. The name David Dennison is used for Donald Trump. The agreement was signed by Stormy Daniels, but never signed by Donald Trump. Then, Michael Cohen used his own money to pay Stormy Daniels. He took out a home equity line of credit and gave Stormy Daniels $130,000. Lauren Merchant is the president of a political advocacy group called Authentic Campaigns, whose clients include the Biden-Harris campaign. Just so you understand, the Biden-Harris campaign. Just so you understand, the Biden-Harris campaign. The judge's daughter makes millions of dollars working on campaigns against Donald Trump. Here's the website. On the website, it claims the company raised $562 million. The judge's wife worked for New York Attorney General Letitia James. The Epoch Times reported that they had reviewed records that show the wife, Laura Merchant, worked for 21 years as special assistant to the Attorney General, including 3 years under Letitia James. She changed jobs 2 years ago. That means the wife worked for Letitia James during the period that Letitia James was building her case against Donald Trump. The judge has issued a sweeping gag order on Donald Trump. This is blatantly unconstitutional. Trump has the right to free speech. Donald Trump is running for president, and one of the key issues in the election is the weaponization of the justice system against political adversaries. Basically, every single accounting record related to this payment is considered fraud. Writing a check was one count. Making the accounting entry is one count. So it's one payment to Stormy Daniels, but they're charging Donald Trump with 34 counts. Now remember that the prosecution is claiming that this check is election fraud. But look closely at the check. It's been paid from Donald Trump's personal bank account, not the campaign funds.
While on the campaign trail, Mr. Bragg boasted about the number of times he had already sued President Trump. In January 2021, Mr. Bragg stated, "I'm the candidate in the race who has the experience with Donald Trump," close quote. He said that it'd be hard to argue with the fact that any case against President Trump would be the most important, most high-profile case. Mr. Bragg won and took office in January 2022. A few weeks after taking office, he told one of his prosecutors, Mark Pomerantz, quote, he could not see a world in which he would indict President Trump and call Michael Cohen as a prosecution witness. Right after campaigning on going after the former president, Bragg gets into office and realizes the case against President Trump is ridiculous. That is why the Southern District of New York didn't bring it. It's why his predecessor, Cy Vance, didn't bring it. Why did Bragg change his mind? Mark Pomerantz, Special Assistant District Attorney, resigned in protest, and he and his fellow Assistant District Attorney, Kerry Dunn, leaked their resignation letter to the New York Times. After that, the left began the pressure campaign on Alvin Bragg, and suddenly the zombie case was resurrected. One of the first things Alvin Bragg did was hire Matthew Colangelo, a top official in the Biden Justice Department who had a history of taking on President Trump and his family's businesses. It's also interesting to note who Mr. Colangelo listed as his references when he applied for the job at the Justice Department. He listed Tom Perez, former DNC chair, and Jeff Zients, who is now President Biden's chief of staff. That's right. The head of the DNC and the Biden White House chief of staff, those were his references. That's the guy who went to work to be the lead prosecutor on the case against President Trump. Alvin Bragg, Matthew Colangelo picked their target, searched for a crime, and then they prosecuted President Trump. The partisan DA that campaigned on going after President Trump, whose newly hired lead prosecutor for the case also had a history of taking on President Trump, also had their case in front of a partisan judge. A judge who donated to President Biden, who imposed a gag order on President Trump, who told the jury they didn't need to reach a unanimous decision, and prevented one of our witnesses today, Mr. Smith, an expert on campaign finance, from giving real testimony to the court. Today, Mr. Smith will be given an opportunity to tell Congress and tell the country what he wasn't permitted to tell the court, what he wasn't permitted to tell the jury. Remember, Bragg and Colangelo bootstrapped charges that are normally misdemeanors to some underlying crime to make the charges a felony. But what was the underlying crime? Prosecutors didn't reveal that until after the trial began. Mr. Colangelo, in his opening statement, accused President Trump of violating the Federal Elections Campaign Act. But the problem is, in the plain reading of that act, doesn't support the indictment or the verdict. As Commissioner Smith stated, allowing this prosecution to go forward and the ultimate jury decision threaten the enforcement procedures established by Congress under the act and stretch the meaning of the statute in such a way as to threaten due process of law. Although Judge Merchan wouldn't permit the leading expert on campaign finance to provide this testimony, he did let someone else speak in the court on this issue and others, Michael Cohen. Michael Cohen, a convicted perjurer, someone even his former lawyer said you couldn't trust. Michael Cohen, who lied to Congress, lied to the FBI, and lied to the court. It's not often you have a witness that can lie to all three branches of government and then become the star witness in the prosecution of a former president. But that's exactly what took place in New York. It is clear Manhattan District Judge Juan Merchan's decisions, guided by political bias, unfairly prejudiced the outcome of the trial and violated President Trump's due process rights. Bragg's prosecution of President Trump, with the help of Judge Merchan, opened the door for politically motivated prosecutions, and it will not be easy to undo the damage that's already been done. As we have seen, other ambitious prosecutors have followed Bragg's lead and pursued politically motivated indictments against the former president. Rather than debate political opponents on substance, the Democrats' strategy to win the 2024 election is through the use of partisan, lawfare tactics. These politically motivated local prosecutions raise substantial federal interest and potential collusion between federal and state authorities. And that is precisely why we are here today. Alvin Bragg's prosecution of President Trump was personal, it was based on politics, and it was wrong.
I'm the one who decided to do this. A lot of people cautioned me against it because I had nothing to gain. The only thing I'm doing is trying to tell the truth to the grand jurors, because I read all these lies in the media that are being promoted by one side. If you see the full picture, you know, listen, if they want to go after Donald Trump and they have solid evidence, so be it. But Michael Cohen is far from solid evidence.
Do you believe the Justice Department should have intervened to protect both the FEC's jurisdiction and its own?
Without question.
And did the Justice Department intervene?
They did not. They only intervened in the Federal Election Commission's investigations.
So in other words, the Biden Justice Department allowed the Manhattan DA's office to usurp both the Justice Department and the FEC's jurisdiction, correct?
Absolutely.
And tell us, why is that problematic?
Well, it's problematic because it sets up a system. Well, first and foremost, it allowed the judge to get the law wrong in this particular case and issue a jury charge that had to do with willful contributions as opposed to knowing and willful contributions, which is what the law requires to be proven. But in a larger picture, it sets up a standard where you can have 50 different states trying federal election crimes under various standards.
Judge Merchan neither stayed nor dismissed the case on primary jurisdiction grounds, did he?
He did not.
I think some of Judge Merchan's evidentiary decisions really throughout the conduct of this trial were frankly astounding. Not allowing Brad Smith to testify the way that he wanted. This is one of the world's leading experts on federal election law. Severely limiting the scope of examination of Robert Costello, who I believe had absolutely damning information about the prosecution's case.
If we look at the other New York cases so far, it does not look good for Trump. A New York jury decided that Donald Trump did not rape E. Jean Carroll, but the jury still awarded her $83 million. Judge Engoron found Donald Trump guilty of manipulating his financials and penalized him $355 million. In the case, Donald Trump's lawyers wanted to issue a subpoena. So the two main people this whole case is about, the judge will not allow the defense to subpoena them.
My prediction is that the Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg and his office are going to request jail time. And considering how biased Judge Merchan was against Trump and his defense team during the entire trial, he's going to sentence Orange Man Bad to wearing a matching Orange Man jumpsuit.
Keep in mind that in the entire history of the United States, this is the first criminal trial with a president.
But for now, and for the foreseeable future, the left and the news media, same thing, are gleefully referring to him as a convicted felon. Here's a montage.
Donald Trump, the twice impeached former president and current Republican nominee, is now running as a convicted felon.
2 words. Convicted felon.
Convicted felon. He is a convicted felon.
Donald Trump guilty as a felon.
Convicted felon.
The 45th president of the United States is now basically convicted felon.
Donald Trump, twice impeached, convicted felon.
Technically, he is a convicted felon. Legally speaking, a convicted felon.
Donald Trump will now campaign for president in this country as a convicted felon. Convicted felon. A former president of the United States, like any other convicted felon. A convicted felon. Convicted felon.
The former leader of the free world, Donald Trump, now a convicted felon.
The former president of the United States, Donald J. Trump, the presumptive Republican presidential nominee, a convicted felon.
He is now tonight a convicted felon.
And he's a felon now.
Donald Trump is a convicted criminal.
He is a convicted felon.
Convicted felon.
He's a convicted felon.
Donald Trump is a convicted felon. And now a convicted felon. Donald Trump is now a convicted felon.
Do we want to be represented, to be led for the first time in history by a convicted felon?
A former president of the United States, now a convicted felon.
And he became a convicted criminal.
You don't want a convicted felon in the Oval Office. You don't want a convicted felon in the Oval Office. You don't want a convicted felon to turn the Oval Office and the federal government into some kind of a racketeering operation.
We do know that a convicted felon can become president of the United States.
And he's now been convicted. He's a convicted felon.
A convicted felon.
Look, the fact is that being a felon is not good.
A president or an ex-president become a convicted felon. That's nothing for anybody to have a lot of joy about.
Donald Trump has been found guilty. What does this moment mean?
Could you say it again slower for me, please? It would be lovely.
Guilty.
Yeah.
All 34.
Could you say it again slower for me, please? It would be lovely.
It's a very sober moment for the country and a very sad moment.
Donald John Trump.
Don't tell me.
Is a convicted felon. Donald Trump refers to himself as a political prisoner and blames you directly. What's your response to that, sir?
If the freedom of speech is taken away, then dumb and silent we may be led like sheep.
The nation, which can prefer disgrace to danger, is prepared for a master and deserves one.
The liberties of a people never were, nor ever will be, secure, when the transactions of their rulers may be concealed from them. The tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants.
The liberties of our country, the freedom of our civil constitution, are worth defending against all hazards. It is our duty to defend them against all attack.
Truth will ultimately prevail where there is pains to bring it to light.